On the surface, President Abraham Lincoln's assassination seems pretty cut and dry. If the history books are to be believed, he was watching a performance at Ford's Theater when he was shot by John Wilkes Booth in the back of the head, ending his life immediately. But we're here to offer an alternative, that maybe, just maybe, John Wilkes Booth was not the killer he is portrayed to be. Stick around to find out why. But before we dive in, if you're interested in early access to videos and live chats with the creator of Intrigued Mind, consider subscribing to our Patreon. Your support will greatly help us keep the channel producing more intriguing content. Before we start, let's make one thing clear. John Wilkes Booth was probably the one who did the actual killing. Multiple sources back up the fact that Booth shot Lincoln, escaped the theater, and was then caught and killed by US soldiers 12 days later. A later investigation clearly indicated that Booth set up a conspiracy where he would murder President Lincoln. Co-conspirators Lewis Powell and David Harold would kill Secretary of State William H. Seward, and a man named George Atzerodt would kill Vice President Andrew Johnson. However, only Booth successfully completed his task, as Seward was only wounded, while Johnson was never attacked at all since Atzerodt got cold feet. But let's, for a moment, consider the compelling evidence of another alternative. Today, we'll be sharing the top 3 theories out there. The most likely alternative theory is that the South had some hand in the murder. You see, when Booth's belongings were searched, a number of mysterious coded letters that linked him to the Confederacy were found. This laid the initial seeds of suspicion, although things got even sketchier when co-conspirator George Atzerodt let a secret slip before trial. Given the fact that Atzerodt was a simple immigrant repairman with little grasp of the English language and no history of armed service in the Confederate Army, this was suspicious. Enter former CIA officer and Army Intelligence General William A. Tidwell, former Department of Labor official James O. Hall, and Department of Defense analyst David W. Gaddy. Working as a team, they pieced together countless primary and secondary documents to come up with a very unique conclusion. They contend that in the last few weeks of the war, the Confederacy was desperate. So desperate, in fact, that they hoped to make one big splash to potentially force a stalemate. They recognized that kidnapping or death of the president could be that splash, and so devised a plan. The first time around, Booth was supposed to kidnap him on his way to a meeting on March 17th of 1865 and hold him for ransom. However, since an aide went in Lincoln's place, the scheme was called off. Then, he was reportedly directed to blow up the White House while General Lee attempted a military defense. However, this was also foiled after the explosives expert who was supposed to help Booth carry out the task was captured by Union forces. After these 2 failures, Booth felt desperate and as a result believed that murdering Lincoln was the only way he would be able to fulfill his mission and restore the Confederacy. So, while the assassination was not called for by the Confederates directly, the idea here is that indirectly they were at fault. Now, on the flip side, there is also evidence to disprove this claim. The most glaring is that the assassination occurred 4 days after Lee surrendered to the Union, making the whole thing pointless from a military standpoint. However, this has been countered with the fact that Booth may have not known this, especially since it often took quite some time for news to circulate in the 1860s. However, far more compelling is the simple fact that Jefferson Davis and other high-ranking Confederates were found to be innocent of these charges at trial. There is also evidence to suggest that Booth was not known to any high-ranking Confederates, especially in a way that would allow them to trust him with such a sensitive task. Therefore, while Booth may have had some contact with the Confederacy, it is more likely that he organized the conspiracy alone. The second most plausible theory is that it was not a political opponent, but a false friend that ordered his murder, and that false friend went by the name of Vice President Andrew Johnson. For context, while Lincoln was a Republican, Johnson was a Democrat. However, at this time, you can think of the parties as being flipped. After all, the Republicans were a relatively progressive anti-slavery party, while the Democrats had traditionally been more conservative and pro-slavery. Therefore, on the surface, choosing Democrat Johnson as a running mate was a strange move, but it undeniably had some benefits. You see, when Lincoln was elected in 1860, he had a different running mate, radical Republican Hannibal Hamlin. While by all means a competent politician, he came from the state of Maine, which by the 1864 election had become firmly Republican. Therefore, Lincoln was better served running with someone from a more contested state, and he found that someone in Andrew Johnson. As the only sitting senator from a Confederate state to not resign their seat during the Civil War, he was a maverick. Despite being aligned with a party filled with pro-slavery and Confederate-leaning politicians, Johnson stayed loyal to the Union, and given that he was from the crucial state of Tennessee, he was chosen to replace Hamlin as Lincoln's running mate. This proved to be a shrewd political move, as Lincoln won the presidency in a complete landslide that year. Now back to the story. By the time Lincoln and Johnson ascended to the White House in 1864, the next big issue on the horizon was Reconstruction. In other words, what to do with the South. While it is impossible to fully know what Lincoln's intentions were, by most accounts, it seemed like he would be pretty harsh on the South, ensuring that the southern states were punished and that, at the very least, black Union soldiers would gain the right to vote. However, Andrew Johnson would have a different idea. In his mind, the Confederate States' only crime was seceding from the Union, and he believed that these individual states had the right to in other ways act as they pleased. This would mean a much softer Reconstruction, and it was something that put the Democrat at odds with Lincoln and the rest of the Republican Party. So much so, in fact, that his repeated clashes ultimately led to him becoming the first president to be impeached in 1868. In any case, 1864 was when these discussions first began, and it was one of several gripes that Johnson likely had against Lincoln. After all, not only was Lincoln part of another party, but he had essentially ignored him after he had acted like a drunken fool at his inauguration. This likely did not make Johnson too happy, and it is plausible that he helped Booth facilitate Lincoln's assassination. On a surface level, the fact that the man supposed to kill him simply decided not to was suspicious. After all, while Lincoln and Secretary of Defense Seward, who were Republicans, were attacked, Johnson, who was a Southern Democrat, was not. However, it doesn't stop there. There is evidence to suggest that Johnson knew Booth, as he had not only watched him before, but had apparently shared mistresses with him. A card owned by Booth was also found in one of his boxes. And for what it's worth, Abraham Lincoln's wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, who had a lot of private access to Johnson, was convinced that he played a part in her husband's murder. This was a belief shared by some members of Congress, and a special assassination committee was even established to examine the claims. When you further consider that Johnson gained the presidency as a direct result of Lincoln's death, it is easy to see why many people were suspicious of him. Yet, this is where the theory more or less stops and ends. This is because, plain and simple, the committee found no evidence of wrongdoing. There was also the fact that it seemed that Booth genuinely did want Johnson to be killed by Atzerodt, and that by most accounts, Johnson did not hate Lincoln enough to do something as low or dangerous to his career as hiring an actor to assassinate him. Therefore, the theory has more or less been debunked. The wildest theory out there pins the assassination on one of the most controversial institutions out there, the Catholic Church. While a long shot at best, the belief stems from the idea that American Catholics were apparently in favor of slavery and opposed to Lincoln. While voting records seem to contest this claim, it goes even further. It has been said that the totalitarian papacy considered Lincoln, who sought to shake up the old order, as being dangerous, especially since he was apparently perceived as being against the church. As a result, the theory goes that Booth was trained by Jesuits and used as their political tool in assassinating Lincoln. As you might expect, the evidence to back this pretty wild claim is circumstantial at best, and by most accounts, the story is complete baloney. As an interesting side note, it's worth noting that in 1964, some more questions about Lincoln resurfaced after the assassination of JFK. That's because it soon became apparent that a number of strange coincidences existed between the two ex-presidents. After all, both were shot in the head on a Friday, were killed by an assassin with a full name composed of 15 letters, and were succeeded by Southerners with the last name Johnson. Therefore, an argument has been made that in some strange way, their assassinations may have been related. However, the far more likely reality is that these are all just coincidences. But we'll leave that for you to decide. Now we bounce it back to you guys. Do you think that any of these conspiracies are plausible? Let us know in the comments down below. For more videos on the most amazing forgotten parts of our history, be sure to subscribe to the Intrigued Mind channel. Like the video, and leave your suggestions in the comments below.